Wonderful. So the recording started. Hi folks, thanks for the wait. Um, Sorry about it. It's just Zoom. It's just how it goes. But welcome to the first workshop of the day. We're just gonna be covering less obvious judging mistakes. I'm Aymaan. I'm joined by Parth. They'll introduce themselves in good time, I'm sure. So the thesis of this workshop is really, really simple. There are judging mistakes that are sometimes less obvious that even really, really good judges make, and good judges make. The thesis of this is just to take you from being a good judge, from being a great judge, try and bump up those scores, especially when you're on panels and things like that. So yeah, if you just proceed. Fantastic. So we're just going to cover, well, we're going to try and cover five things. Given the delay, we'll see how far we get because we want to leave good time for you guys to ask questions. So firstly, just what the AIV should know, and the thesis of that is just that the AIV is not stupid, covering things like argument logic, deliberation, contribution, speaker points, and then also a short thing on evaluating burdens. But Parth will cover this when we get like down the line later on that they'll cover this at Copenhagen Open. You should look out for that video because that will be more holistically looking at what burdens are in debates. Fantastic. So the AIV, there's like a description there, the long one about what the AIV is. You'll hear lots of things about what the AIV is as well. It could be the average informed voter, could be the average intelligent voter. O just means ordinary. IGC is like informed global citizen, ordinary reasonable. They're all the same thing basically. But if you don't want to read the big thing, that's fine. Essentially, what it is it's a person that can judge BP and like knows the rules and they know things, but like not too much things. But we'll cover what the not too much things are. And the common misconception here is that they don't know anything because they don't know too much things. But actually they do know much things. They just don't know too much things. So I'll cover what these are just now. Fantastic. So basically, the problem right now with people using the AIV is that they often regard the AIV as the average idiot voter and that just like doesn't know anything and things like that. So the heuristic that I want you to take from this workshop about what the AIV is just to take like each part of the name separately, right? So they're a voter and they are intelligent or informed or something like that. When it says average, it doesn't mean they have average information or ordinary information. It just means the echolocation of that human is average or ordinary. So they don't come from a particular place. They're not a particular gender assignment or anything like that. But it doesn't have to do with their information, essentially. It's just like separately an amalgamation of humanity as being of intuition as opposed to what knowledge they have. So that's what I want you to take away from this. But we'll go into five mistakes now that people make with the AIV and how to avoid them. Fantastic. So the first thing to remember is that unfortunately, you might just be less knowledgeable than the AIV. I would posit that I'm less knowledgeable than the AIV for reasons that I'll say in a second. But the manual does explicitly state that they're unlike any real world people. So they probably have knowledge about a bunch of different things that you probably don't really know about. And this is kind of hard to sort of come to terms with insofar as like I guess we don't I guess most people have very specialized knowledge about what they're very interested in and the area that they come from, etc. But this is not what the AIV is. They don't have that specialist knowledge, but they have broad knowledge about the world in general. So obviously the big problem here is like, how can I reward a fact that I don't know? Like, so a speaker says a fact and you don't know whether that's true or not. You don't want to seem like an idiot by not rewarding it because then, the speakers know more than you do sort of thing. But you don't also want to be an idiot by rewarding something that is false. So things like that. So the first thing that I want you to do here is just assess the underlying and surrounding analysis. I know this sounds like what you're told all the time, and it kind of is, right? But obviously it is the case that claims that are poorly explained, like even if they're non-empirical or if they're empirical, are just harder to credit in general. So how is this fact explained? What is the underlying analysis when creating that fact? Because like everything there is just a premise, right? So the fact will premise something and it will be premised by something. So what does it premise and does it logically lead to the other outcomes that it is trying to do? Or are the premises of these facts something that you're able to believe? The second thing is just to gut check it. Like most things in the world are not really that unbelievable when it comes to facts and when it comes to like knowledge that you can credit or not credit. So if it sounds somewhat plausible, I would posit that most of the time it should be fine. And notice you won't ever get penalized as a judge, but you won't ever get looked down upon as a judge for like crediting a fact that is slightly off because the speaker is like slightly off about it. Like if they say something like 49% of people act in X way when it's actually like 47%, the intuition in the debate is all the same. So I wouldn't be too pedantic about the facts that you credit, just to make sure that it sounds logical and it sounds plausibly that it could happen in the world. That's fine too. Um, the third thing just to check is like what it is in the debate. So often facts are an outcome of certain analysis, and often facts are like the premise to certain analysis and things like that. So then what I want you to do is just assess where it is in the logical chain of what is going on in the debate and what that speaker is saying. So there's obviously like a lot of other things that the speaker will be saying that aren't facts and aren't empirical knowledge. There'll be other things like rebuttal, etc. So what stage is it at? And are you able to pinpoint this and things like that? So these are the things that I want you to assess when you do that. Ooh. Fantastic. Thing number two, this one's really short. Make sure you judge off the knowledge of the AIV and not the intuitions of the AIV. That's why the AIV exists. It's just a parameter that you need to use when there's a piece of empirical knowledge that people may or may not know, just to make sure that debates don't become like overtly specialist in its knowledge and make sure it's accessible for everyone. But don't judge off of their intuitions. So basically, if there is something and you think the AIV would think X, Y, Z about it, try and ensure that you stay within the realms of the debate when you're doing that, as opposed to just like what the AIV would think. Because it is probably true that the average person given information kind of amalgamates that differently based on their intuitions. Maybe the intuition like right now is that the average intelligent voter would be like somewhat quite right wing and things like that. I would avoid any of these biases that you think the AIV could have and just make sure that you're adjudicating off of the knowledge that they have and things like that. Miscellaneous thing three. This one's quite important, and this is the first step where I think people make a mistake and think that the AIV is not as knowledgeable as the AIV is supposed to be. So the main thing is they lack specialist knowledge. They don't lack technical knowledge. So what I mean by this is that just because something is maybe more technical sounding, sounds like GCSE science or something like that, it doesn't make it specialist in knowledge. Specialism is probably just like really in-depth knowledge about a certain thing. You can probably take the parameters of like you would have to study quite deeply to understand this thing within the first place, as opposed to if you were to tell someone this, it would be like pretty believable to them and they could echolocate it based on their other knowledge and things like that. And the common mistake people make here is they're very willing to credit empirics to do with society, cultural affairs, or like politics or economics. So, things like Parasite won the Oscar, or recently the BJP was forced into coalition and things like that, just because they're political and cultural affairs. But other empirics, things like hydrogen batteries are more long-lasting and eco-friendly than petrol engines because they don't require a combustion reaction, or like Japan is uniquely impacted by climate change due to where it's situated around like tectonic plates and things like that. I would posit have maybe even more analytical rigor than the previous statements, if not as empirical at least as the previous statements, and are just true given, I would say, general knowledge that people are able to have about these things. But often judges are more aggy about crediting these things because they think it is specialist. I would just posit it's not specialist. Try and think about the depth of knowledge you need in that field. In terms of like how specialist the knowledge is, as opposed to the knowledge just being technical and therefore you don't credit it because technical knowledge is just fine. And the other way to think about it is a lot of people have technical knowledge about how the economy works, and econ spec is very willing to be credited, even though it is technical in nature. But if it's not specialist, then you're very willing to credit it. So I would do it sort of in all cases. The fix I said to this is just fix up. I guess that's a bit facetious, but like it's just like the extent to which you have rigor around certain logical chains. Refer to the earlier stuff about, even if you don't know it, what is surrounding this kind of analysis, etc. Fantastic. The fourth thing is just like ask yourself how much more they can do. And the thesis here is I think a lot of people say that judges should be charitable. maybe don't enter that mindset because it's not your job to be charitable. It's your job to be reasonable given the parameters that exist in the debate and things like that. But the presence of logical links that you can assess is probably quite important. So the example I have here is that the president of Turkmenistan implemented a ban on non-white cars. Uh, uh, like like maybe on the face of it, you would hear that and be like, oh, that's maybe a more specialist claim or a claim that the AIV wouldn't know and things like that. Maybe, but also I would posit you can credit it insofar as like I'm not really sure how much further this could be taken. Like I don't know what reasonable incentive or capacity analysis makes this claim more true or more false or something like that. So I think I would be generally like willing to credit, especially if it once again, going back to criteria two and miscellaneous thing one, um, like like if it sounds reasonable and sounds reasonable that could happen, just think about like how much more explained something can be. I feel like you can credit things. I feel like we're willing to credit things as structural reasons because you get to the root mechanism of what the logical explanation is. But if the root mechanism is just this and there are no other mechanisms underlying it, then this is the root mechanism now, right? So credit it. Fantastic. The fifth thing to remember, and this is the main thing, is you actually read a lot as the AIV, and a lot more than people actually think you do. Because the way it's taught to us, especially at a lower level, is that the AIV reads like newspapers and just reads the headlines of those newspapers, and that's how they get their information and doesn't read into depth and anything. Uh, Maybe that's true, but remember that you're a global person, so you're not place set anywhere. So I guess the more likely manifestation of the AIV is that they read the headlines of all sorts of newspapers and things like that. And the second thing is like I would just say most people don't read that many headlines every day. Like you got to think like there's like I put the Guardian, BBC, and Economist just as a reference point. There are so many broadsheets and there are so many technical magazines and things like that out there that are informative. And you got to think how often they publish. So each of them have like nine sections. There's like news, opinion, science and tech, lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera. And all of them have like maybe like 15 headlines per day or lots of headlines. I would posit in the course of this, assuming that the AIV remembers all of this, which, as we consider, generally they do, you would know quite a lot. At this stage, if anyone has any questions, I'm willing to answer them. We're about to go into this exercise, so that should be fun. No, if there aren't any questions, we can move on. So, okay, so the exercise we're going to do now is called "Would you credit this?" Uh, this would have been more fun in person. I reckon what we'll do is in the chat, if you guys like if the participants just type in Y for yes, I would credit this. YB for yes, no. YB yes, but I'd be willing, I'd need to be persuaded by it. So yeah, yes, but or N for no. So like if the participants just have their chat features ready, and we'll get started. Good crack. First one is states in the USA are generally all connected via federal highways. What do we think? Y, YB, or N? Yeah, yeah, I would broadly agree with all of you. I think I would credit this too. Like this is just true sort of thing. Cool. We can go into the next one. Sheikh Hasina was exiled to India following the student protests in Bangladesh. Yeah, you all said yes. I think I'd be generally willing to credit this. Maybe it needs some underlying analysis as to what these student protests were, but it's one of those ones where it's like, actually, how much more can you explain on this? Like, she was exiled for obvious reasons. India is geographically close, that sort of thing. Like, if people gave those explanations, they would be unnecessary. So I think, yeah, I would say yes. Australia is the biggest producer of bauxite and lithium in the world. Bauxite is the ore that creates aluminium. So we got a yes but, a yes but, and a yes. If you guys, it is being recorded. If you guys don't mind speaking and want to unmute your mics and just explain the yes buts, maybe I'll go to Mia first. Only if you're willing. If you don't unmute, then I'll assume you're not willing, and that's fine.
Yeah, so I think probably it's common knowledge that Australia is a large producer of mined minerals. I think that is quite frequently in the headlines, specifically to do with like environmental regulations or those sorts of things. I think it would maybe require a little bit more explanation as to like how bauxite is the ore that creates aluminium or by what process, or just like something, because I don't think it is necessarily common knowledge that that is the mineral that would create that usable metal.
Naz, are you along similar lines, or do you have anything else to add?
No, I think the same.
Yeah, I think there would need to be some explanation as to like, maybe some other producers of things like bauxite and aluminium, why Australia is competitive, things like that, in order to make this persuasive. I think as a fact, like the willingness to credit is probably a good thing to have. So I think you guys did well there. Next one. CSA, so Cricket South Africa, selection quotas for inclusions of Black and minority ethnic players. Yeah, I would agree. I think this is a yes, but sort of one, insofar as I think you probably need, at least to make it a persuasive mechanism, like explanations as to why they have these incentives to do that. And I think you can do that and things like that, why the capacity exists, and maybe some other empirical examples of reflection and things like that. You would hope for something of this spec, there would be an info slide or something like that. But I think you guys did well there. Next one. Mexico has free public universities. Fair enough. Yeah, this one's a bit of the reason I included this one is I used it in a debate and it worked. I reckon you could probably do incentive and capacity analysis surrounding it. I think I'd be generally willing to credit this sort of thing. Insofar as like I think given the global positioning of the AIV, it is likely they would know this sort of thing about Mexico. But I don't know. Like Abby, what makes you unsure if you're willing to unmute? No, that's fine. Mia, like, why the no? What do you think?
I don't know, I just think capacity and incentive analysis could be applied to universities in any country. Like, presumably, all countries do have an incentive to provide free education at this level because it's good for their economy or it makes people happy or whatever. So, I don't know if there's a way to make that specific to Mexico in a way that definitely confirms that this is a fact.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I reckon then like there would be other empirics about Mexico that you would need to know. But I think as the judge, we ought be reasonable about like where people position their other spec about Mexico to make this true about Mexico sort of thing. Like, but maybe standalone, yeah, maybe you ought not credit this. Next one. In general, wages outcompete inflation. Yeah, 100%. This one definitely needs an explanation. And people often don't do this. This is a segue into section two. Next one. The coup that overthrew Thomas Sankara was supported by the United States and France. Yeah, I think you're all right here. Like, I think this one definitely needs more of an explanation about like who Thomas Sankara is, when this happened, things like that, and why the United States and France would want to support this. In the empirics, it is like somewhat alleged that they did. I'm not going to make a statement about whether they did or not, but yeah, like YB is probably correct. I think the next one's the last one. Green Book won the Best Picture in 2017. I think I would generally agree that I'd be willing to credit this one, insofar as I don't know what more you could probably say on this. I do think people generally know things about this. This one was designed to catch you guys out because Green Book didn't actually win Best Picture in 2017. It won it in 2018. But irrespective, it's one of those where it's like, even though the fact is a year wrong, probably in the overall chain of analysis, it ends up being somewhat unimportant that it is wrong. So I think you can credit this sort of thing. If there are no further questions on the AIV, we'll move on to the next section. Fantastic. Moving into logic then. What we'll just be covering here is internal logic, face value, and interventions, and buying somewhat, and what you ought to do here. Fantastic. So the current problems I think with judges and logic is firstly, and this is the most important thing, buying mechanisms at face value. The second thing is being too stringent on logical conclusions. And the third thing is assuming logical priority. So if we just go on, I'll explain each of these things. So the main thesis of this is that you should intervene in logic to a reasonable degree. And I know at a novice level, we teach judges to not be interventionist. And the obvious reason for this is that we don't want people to, in the outset of judging, judge given their own intuitions and own opinions. But once you are more attuned to adjudicating based on logic, you should intervene to which this logic is persuasive. And the thesis here is that you're an adjudicator, not an arbitrator. So adjudicate. Fantastic. So in terms of buying mechanisms at face value, step one, don't do this. Step two, basically what you want to do is obviously when teams give you a claim for example, teams are like, this increases buy-in. Obviously you'll have skepticism because you don't know why it would increase buy-in. But then some guy will stand up and they'll be like 7 mex. And then you just often judges will assume that the premise is proven just because of the amount of mechs that are given, as opposed to the persuasiveness of these mechs. So I think the next slide might be an example. So we'll talk through this. So yeah, an example of this, which I've done in previous workshop, is this house regrets the association of the Rust Belt post-industrial closures to the Dust Bowl of the Great Depression by American media. And notice that the claim given by Elo here is that the portrayal of the Rust Belt is run down and torn apart, gave heavy workers catharsis. And normally you'd be like, like why? Like, yeah, and if they gave no reasons for this in the OA, you'd be like, well, why is this true? But then I'm given 5 mechanisms. But I want you to look at each of these mechanisms, and you realize that none of these are actually very good mechanisms. Like closed workplaces and feel nostalgic about them has nothing to do with the association. Families and friends now understood why displaced workers are so sad. This needs more of an explanation as to why the association causes that. It gives them legitimacy to not finding work. And then the fifth one is gives the folk that do want to find work motivation to find new work. So, soft contradiction there. And then the fourth one is maybe the most exclusive mechanism because, it actually has a relationship between the Rust Belt and the Dust Bowl. But the end mechanism is like they themselves are also hungry. Maybe more of an explanation is needed about how they feel and why they're able to relate to these things. But I think what I want you to think about is think of like the best speaker you know. And they give this claim and they give these 5 mechanisms and they do it really, really fast. And then you're like, this is probably proven. I think you should take as much skepticism to each of these mechanisms and see whether they logically lead to the conclusion that you want, firstly, and secondly, see if they are actually relational to the change that occurs in the motion. Next one. Logical conclusions is credit. So basically, so think of like friends along the way. So you're getting from A to B, right? And then people are like, oh, you make friends along the way. Sometimes teams will make impacts along the way, but they're not the impacts that they credit, not the impacts that they claim. I still think there is a degree to which you should credit this, insofar as I think that is what you can reasonably credit in a team. So this is kind of the inverse of the thing before, where judges tend to buy too little and they don't assess like the holistic persuasiveness of the claim within the first place. So in the same way you should criticize their logical links, it's also possible that their logical links are able to grant them something, even if it's not their intended end impact. So I think I have an example. So yeah, so for the motion, this House would ban the establishment of trade unions in essential sectors. Like the LO stands up and says trade unions are essential in getting public employees pay rises. And the three mechanisms are here. So central extra governmental support, publicity, and trade union bosses have good incentives. I would say that if it was just these three mechanisms, maybe they, given the previous thing, don't logically lead to the conclusion that you are guaranteed pay rises, or at least the claim of pay rises is quite high burden. But even if the LO here doesn't claim that you get better awareness, and that in and of itself is a good thing, I think you are able to credit to some extent that you do get publicity and that you do like, and that trade union bosses do have good incentives. So some good outcomes are able to occur. So maybe look at the logical conclusions of what the mechanisms are. And even if you're unwilling to credit the end impact, there might be some degree to which you're able to credit like an impact along the way, like friends along the way sort of thing. Next one. Logical priority. Okay, so this one is a bit tricky, and you will probably get this wrong a lot in your judging career. I get it wrong all the time. Really, really good judges also get this wrong all the time. But I think the important thesis here is just to make sure it doesn't leave your mind and make sure you're being an active judge about this thing. So there are two notes here. The first thing is that teams win debates by being more persuasive in their reasons to pass or fail the motion. You know this, like teams win the debate by being persuasive. So the second note is that logical priority is no longer a reason a team can win the debate. So this is also just being premised on an opening team's analysis, i.e. they have a prior analytical or logical link to the team below. Next one. Okay, so the issue here is when assessing benches on logical priority or being premised, absent of actively inserting yourself on like how persuasive each of these teams are in the abstract of the debate, adjudication often just becomes really, really lazy. And maybe you guys all would have heard this as a speaker while being in a closing team, where you give like a fire member or a fire whip, like eliciting your contribution to the debate and why it's so much better than the opening. But what the opening has done is like slightly analyzed the like trade-off of the motion, and based on this you guys are entirely premised on this. I think on this you need to analyze whether the premise that the closing is dependent on was well analyzed, to the extent to which that premise is the thing that persuades you to pass or fail the motion. And like on the other side, like sometimes teams will be premised on a single link, but everything else they say in the debate is more persuasive. On this, you need to be an adjudicator. Like, what is your call on what is persuasive in the debate? Next slide. So on the example of this House would ban vapes, like the Prime Minister could say few people vape, so few people get carbon monoxide poisoning and get popcorn lung. And then member of government runs a case of there's less environmental waste. A lazy judge here would say that closing government is premised on opening government because Prime Minister analyzes why fewer people vape. Maybe that's true, and maybe that is a prior analytical link to there being less environmental waste because there are fewer vapes in circulation. But the issue with this is that Prime Minister kind of just analyzed the trade-off of the motion, and it makes it undebatable for closing teams if that is the thing that closing government is entirely premised on. So here, obviously, I haven't given you the full claims or the full analyses, but I would make sure that you are willing to be persuaded by the network, I guess, or like the net persuasiveness of each of these claims, even if it is the case that there is a prior analytical link that opening government has already touched on, things like that. Are there any questions at this stage? Fantastic. Next one. I believe it's yours. Yep. We'll move on to Parth now, but thanks, folks.
Cool. Am I can be heard? Because I want to check
Yes,
that.
yes, you're all good.
Great. So I'm going to talk about how you should structure the way you give contributions and deliberations as a wing, as a chair. And I think this is one of the biggest things that stops people from really hitting good judge scores, because getting the right call is obviously like almost half the battle. But you need to be able to justify why that is true. So, for example, someone who may give a slightly wrong call or a fully wrong call, but can justify it and know when they're wrong, often can sometimes get a higher score than someone who can't justify the call at all, but has the exact correct call as the chair, or the actual call, or the true call. So I'm now going to go through some things as to what you should think about when giving deliberation contributions and how you should structure them. So, what are the types of contributions that you are likely to give? So there are, first of all, case summaries, which you often have to do very briefly, and I'll go into explaining how you should do that. New additions provided by closing teams. This is really important in today's, as they call meta, or like the turning points in debate, where often, as Aymaan has like sort of dispelled or demystified, actually closing teams get hard done by judges right now, but actually, the burdens you need to hit in closing are not actually that high. So you need to really make a key note of the actual contributions that closing are making, because a chair or you as a wing might want to know, or sorry, for us from a wing, might want to know specifically what closing has added to determine whether that's a sufficient extension. So you need to make extra notes, I guess, on like the unique things, or like highlight the unique things that closing are actually giving. Obviously, the classic one is why a team won a comparison. And then also responding to the chair and the wing. I won't talk much about this, but it falls under what I'm going to talk about in the other summaries and how you structure things. And I will come back to this in a second. Often, I like to say, if I'm the chair, can you spend 30 seconds doing this or 1 minute doing this, so the wing knows how much time they have. But some judges don't do that, and often a good ballpark is that if they're asking you to summarize, they might cut you off at 30 seconds, or if it's a justification, a minute. So these are the things you have to think about when thinking about deliberation contributions. So how do you then summarize a deliberation in a case in deliberation? So what we really don't want is someone to parrot all of the reasons why something exists, and also going through the mechanisms and explaining them how the speaker did. So the speaker will give a claim at the top of their headline, and then also give what they think the I guess the top mechanism is. So, for example, contact theory is one of the mechanisms, but it may not be the case that they just say contact theory, presumably, and hopefully rather, they actually explain what contact theory is. But we don't need you as the judge to explain what contact theory is, because presumably it will be in other people's notes. So how you should start your contribution is having the end claim, so hopefully an impact. So on this clash, so in yellow, you are saying to the judge that this is a thing that team necessarily wants to win on. And this is something that people actually forget, because as a judge, you need to work out as a group what you think the most important clashes are in the debate. Because note that burdens are created from emotions. So, for example, defending emotion, like the X comparative or the Y comparative of the emotion, but also teams self-set their burdens by virtue of the fact that they're running an impact that relates to that claim, right? And then they will weigh those burdens, and then that produces the clash. So you need to then determine what you think the most important clashes are, and also explain that to the speaker, right? So if highlighted at the top of your contribution that you think the discrimination clash is important, it helps in the deliberation, because then the judge knows, or the other judges, what you specifically think is most important. And then you say, well, the team wants to prove this in green, and then give these 3 mechanisms. But also, when you give the mechanisms, give maybe a short example, a short sentence about how well you think the argument was proven, because that will save some time going into the later discussion about what your actual opinion about this is. So, for example, I've noted in the media exposure claim, though this is mostly asserted, you've saved some time before you even go into the justification about what you think of those things. So other judges should have noted the mechanism, so you don't need to clarify these things. So I hope that makes sense. And often what I see is literally just a splurge of words from most judges I judge with, of just like, oh, here's, like, they say all of the things in the quotations, but it's just so spread out. And all we need to do is just like I guess like a robotic laundry list, which I guess debating can be quite robotic at times, of like what was said. And that is it. I just need boom, boom, boom. And then that is literally it. And, because we only have 15 minutes, this is the sort of contributions that I think people should be giving. So I would follow this. This this example will work for every single summarizing. So like I would just do this because it saves so much time. But also the first impression matters. So summarizing often is the first thing that you do. If you show that you're confident summarizing things, it's obvious to the judge that you're good at tracking cases, and then that already puts you in a good mood in the mind of the chair. Or if you are evaluating your own wings, that's obviously nice for you as well. Right. Then when you're weighing, so when you justify a pairwise comparison, you need to first of all list the key clashes that teams disagree on in a pairwise comparison. How do you know this? This is just very simple. If you were speaking in a debate, you would be rebutting a claim, or you would be doing comparative weighing. You'd be explaining that something goes up or down, or you know, it gets better or worse, etc. And you would also hopefully be weighing as to what necessarily you think is most important. Even if they don't, implicitly they could be saying, well, I think this is important, and then another team says this is important, and then you will start to understand that they may disagree on the impacts of the debate. So you want to first briefly list these. So that's the first step. Then, second of all, if teams, and this is something that you should be making a note on, so maybe in a different color on the side of your page, in the same color, just saying clash 1 or clash 2, or on a separate piece of paper when you write out the summaries of each team. I've not actually got that in my notes, but actually having a separate page where you summarize the cases of teams and like list the mechanisms like I did in the previous slide will help a lot. So if teams have done something, does it help one more than the other? So, and briefly mention that. So for example, if both teams agree on a group's behavior or incentives, so for example, when you say, oh, well, artists care about a certain thing, like, you know, being authentic or representing themselves, if a team has a clearer claim as to how they're able to be representative or something like that, then if the other team has agreed on it, it's a clash that should be weighed slightly higher in the debate, as per the manual, because, well, all else being equal, that is, because they thought, well, you both agree, therefore it's a claim that's weighed higher because it's an agreement, right? So and then it will benefit both sides. You also want to mention that as well, right? Because that's also important in determining. But also, as you know, we should be caring about things like holistic adjudication. So we always have to not just weigh analysis, weighing and rebuttal. So the example below, this is now this is what you a boilerplate, and obviously worded like this. I mean, like the previous slide, I feel like you should do it that way, and I don't think many people have a problem with doing it that way. But obviously, if you have a different way of doing it, please write in the chat or interrupt me if you do. I've not got the chat open because I'm sharing screen, so just someone can let me know unmuting themselves with what question. But in yellow, what we have is the thing that the judge wants to know is what is the comparison. So this is the GovBench comparison. What are GovBench trying to prove? What are the key clashes? So here it's that proving that the harm of destabilization is greater than the op, which is trying to push that there's good forms of military intervention, as they have to challenge the strong opposition pushes on Western actors actually caring about the region that the debate is talking about. Now, both sides agree that reducing the number of deaths is the most important metric. Great. So we now have a clear indication that whichever GovBench team wins is the one that's likely to prove that the harm of destabilization is greater, and that they are proving that the number of deaths maybe is higher on opposition bench, right? So then we actually go into the comparison. While OG asserted that this would destabilize the region by saying it would be like Iraq, note that Aymaan's I've sort of copied Aymaan's examples of I'm trying to follow on from his AIV. So you should now know that that is not something you should credit. CG actually provided two distinct mechanisms: foreign interference and Russian incentives, and secondly, backlash radicalization. The latter explains why the situation would get worse, which is more robust against opposition bench challenges, which is a reason why you should preference a team. So not only is their mechanization better, but they're actually responding to teams that have all agreed on the metric of the debate. So hopefully that makes sense. Please feel free to interrupt me because I know this is quite complicated, because I guess this is quite abstract and you'd probably have to watch a debate and practice these things. And I guess I'm not given the motion. I didn't really think of one. Okay, right. But how would you do these things? So how would you know to get this information? Because obviously you might say, we only get 2 minutes of silent thought, and then it's very hard for us to come up with all of that and formulate that. The first one is that I think it just takes a lot of practice, but there are some steps you can take to make it easier for yourself. So the first one is being an active judge and making notes of what could be important in the deliberation. So you need to be making notes on what you think about the cases as the speakers are speaking. I would say that for judging in general, and not just for making good contributions, if you're not doing that, you're going to really struggle with formulating some sort of call or some sort of coherent thing to say in the deliberation. There's not enough time to do that. And that obviously also takes practice. So at the end of the top half, at the end of after closing government speaking, on your summary paper, you might want to write, these are the, first of all, you want to go, here are the two impacts of both of these teams in the comparison. And then look at the impacts and go like, well, what are these impacts actually and how do they interact with each other? So we have two different impacts, but if they're talking about a group and their incentives, then the clash might be an incentive clash, even if they're talking about different groups, right? So even if the impacts are different, you can find the commonalities in the way that they're proving things to then derive what you think the actual clash actually is. Then you want to look at, as I said before, rebuttal and weighing. What do teams choose to rebut? And even if they don't tell you why they're doing that, because teams are really awful at doing that, to work out why do you think they could be rebutting those things. Obviously not giving them full credit for the rebuttal because they've not actually weighed the rebuttal, but like why they could be giving that rebuttal. And that could be because they think one part of another team's case is reliant to take down for their own case to work, right? That's often the case. You don't rebut everything in debating because you don't have time. So you need to think about why they're choosing to rebut those things. And then you obviously have weighing, right? Because so a team might think that this piece of weighing is important, so it makes it more contentious for that team, right? So they want to win on that as well. But also, unless a debate is really, really clear, what could the devil's advocate be for the other team to win the pairwise comparison and then reverse engineer, right? So why is that not true? Like, you can find a reason as to why they win, but why do you not believe that thing? Because then it's easier to justify going backwards. And then also, what is the deliberation aiming to do? Now, this seems a bit weird, but what I mean by that is that if a debate is very framing heavy, an evaluation of the plausibility or the robustness of the framing, for example, an IR motion, is probably going to be the thing that affects the call first. Like, who's got the best framing? Like, you want to look at those sort of things before you dive into the mechanisms or the weighing or the rebuttal, because if lots of teams are relying upon framing being true, it's about what you think you buy out of that framing first before you then go on to evaluating the mechanism. And that's an easier way. In a lot of spec-heavy motions, you might get bogged down in all of these things. And you just want to take it one step at a time by thinking about what you think the contentious thing of the deliberation might be. If you think it's a close debate, make sure you write down exactly what the speaker says so you can quote it in the deliberation if necessary. Thinking about being an active judge, do you think that this team is now really close to another team? If so, pay more attention to making notes on that team. But I would advise for most debates to take detailed notes. As in, like, take detailed notes, but don't take down everything. Right, giving some heuristics as to what maybe you should think about in the debate to write down and also in what could come up in deliberation. First of all, preemption. This is really, really common, which can easily solve sometimes, well, I guess for debaters who actually give the preemption, could easily solve a clash by just a pure virtue of someone's given preemption and no one's responded to it, right? So does their model preclude or exclude or mean that something must happen in a way that they get some of their benefits from the model exists, modeled out certain things, or they've, it's about a specific thing in general when they've defined the motion, when they said that this is what, I don't know, like moral offset looks like and things like that. This is a thing that we're going to win on. Often, like, this is a really easy way for you to determine whether something is like, is how it's interacting in the clash. Also, the framing of the motion. So, is the motion saying the rise of, and then it's mainly about the rise. If you don't talk about the rise, but you talk about the thing in general, like this house regrets the rise of citizen journalism, so journalism which is done a lot by people on the ground rather than journalists. If people just talk about the good and bad of citizens and journalism, that's not actually the motion, it's about the rise of, and that could be a way to determine the clash. Meta weighing. So this is it's not really a term. I think it's a William Smith term, but it's basically a term to suggest like what should matter the most in the debate, irrespective of the cases that are provided by teams. Should we be caring about like the sort of agency actors in general? Should we be caring about the fact that something in particular is going to happen, even if some teams haven't proved it, and all that sort of stuff? So what matters most in a motion type like this, like a sports motion? Is it about fans and things like that? Then talk about plausibility. So everything that Aymaan has said already, just insert there. I don't want to go over that. I think that Aymaan did a good job on that. And then contribution to the round. So that's why I've talked about reverse engineering a lot. What is the case trying to prove? How does that actually affect the motion? Think about tipping points. So tipping points is like, have they given a mechanism that actually shows that this will definitely change in a way that if they said it will? Like, can you actually think that that mechanism will, all of the things that Aymaan has been saying? And then, as I've said, also, what do other teams in the round agree and disagree on? What are the contentious points of clash? There are impacts. They've said they're going to prove an impact. Have they actually proved the impact? Have they gone from A to B? Has a justification been given as to why the impact matters and weighing against other impacts? This is really important. And then finally, tensions. So people contradict and knife themselves or knife their own partner, not, more than actually knifing someone else on another team, right? Like you often will say one mechanism and then give in your laundry list of mechanisms, another mechanism which knifes one of the mechanisms in your own set of mechanisms. So you also want to think about, hang on, a speaker just said this. Could this also be true at the same time? So I think that you need to think also very clearly about tensions too. Right. How to work on this in your spare time? Honestly, I would go start at debates which are maybe complicated and messier so you can learn how to maybe work out what the burdens are, what the main contentious clashes are, and how you would formulate a deliberation contribution. Because often this will be easy in debates that are clear, but it will be hard in debates that are not. So maybe watch videos of finals or just any round really on YouTube, and then maybe like write down as a judge a debate, and there are loads of them. If you want to practice pairwise justifications, watch the top half and practice it. If you want to get better at evaluating closing, watch top half and CG and do government bench. There are also some in-rounds recorded, so you could check the tab afterwards to see if your call was actually accurate, although, there could have been splits which are not recorded, or like the judges may not actually be correct, but, you'd hope that they are. I'm just a cynical person. And then also judge your internal debates and spars and just get feedback from your friends. Like, for deliberation contribution, you don't actually have to be the chair. You could just be the wing, and then you can get feedback from the chair, or you could just practice your own contribution on a speaker in the debate and see if they agree with it and what you said in the actual deliberation. That all works. Okay, are there any questions before we move on? I've got 15 minutes left, and I feel like speaker points will be very quick. I just care about speaker points a lot. Okay, when someone tells you that the average speaker score, or like the average speaker score is 75 because it's in the middle of the speaker scale, they're lying to you. The scale is not linear, and it should not be treated as linear. And I'm going to now, let me get my notes up, sorry, because I've actually made extra notes on this. So there, it's not a 75, and I don't know, I think probably maybe a 77. But like, you need to think about speaker points more holistically and the value of them rather than the numbers in the scale. So let's go into that very briefly. So, my password's linked. Sorry, I've got notes on a separate computer. Oh, there we go. Right, good. Okay. Right, so heuristics. So again, what should you be thinking about when allocating speaker points? Because arguably, the bullet points in the speaker scale are not very clear in terms of they don't really reflect words that are found in the manual or stuff that we actually really think about. But some heuristics are, can you identify their line of argument? So when it says arguments are clear to follow, what this actually trying to ask you is, can you get from A to B and understand exactly what they're saying, or are they, unclear? Like, do you know what the start claim is, and have they explained and done every rung of the ladder to get to the end claim? And then that's slightly separate from clarity, because clarity is like, does it actually make sense? But the line of argument is, can you logically follow the chain of analysis that is actually happening? The next one is obviously comparative, and that is just very simple. Arguments are generally like creditable when they actually prove something is changing, because obviously motions are trying to explain that something gets, you're trying to say if something is true or false, or if you prefer something to something else. So there needs to be some level of comparative there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But here, what you want to do is you need to evaluate whether those mechanisms are just proving that this could potentially be true, or that there is a tipping point. So like, actually, is there a really good reason why something would change, or a really low burden, intuitive reason why something would change? So you are very certain of that actually happening in the first place. Or do you think that when you can provide comparativeness through rebuttal, has someone purely mitigated a claim, i.e. have they just provided a reason why something is like might not be true, or like pushed them, you know, it could be less true than they actually thought, or actually is it a flip? Like, have they given an actual reason why the opposite is true? And then that is also a comparative reason. Then also burden fulfillment. So have the teams actually fulfill the burdens of what they said that they would, and how vulnerable is the analysis chain? So what I mean by how vulnerable is the analysis chain? If your analysis is predicated on one incentive or one fact about the world being true, the chain is likely to be more vulnerable than not. So it might be vulnerable to a good response, right? Or a decent response because, you know, one response could take down the entire chain. But if you have interdependent mechanisms, which is a very difficult thing to do, and it's what, you know, separates like good speakers from great speakers, is having given different reasons why something could be true, and a team on the other side would have to give multiple sets of rebuttal to reduce the claim. And that we're starting to think about high speaker points. Strategic value. Has a team actually told you and like held your hand and said, you know, Parth, this is how we're going to win the debate. And I'm going to tell you why this is the way we win the debate. So the meta weighing, right? Like why we should win this debate and for what reasons that is true, rather than just weighing their case. They're actually telling you how you should actually attempt to judge the debate, which, you know, can be cocky sometimes, but, you know, it's actually kind of nice when you're a judge and everyone's really messy for someone to go like, actually, this is how you should judge a debate, because that's really helpful sometimes. And then also engagement. It's not just about analysis, rebuttal and weighing matters. So what things matter? Because I think these speakers people usually get, you know, wound up about. So what separates a 78 from a 79? I would say that the line of argument tends to be less clear in a 78. So I actually don't think it's that difficult to get a 78. That might be a hot take, but, you know, we're all here for hot takes. So I think that, you know, just proving something and then it's having some relevance to the motion is probably and like it's not super, like it's explained well enough that there's not a massive gap as to why that's actually true, and they give some reasons why you should believe that claim, is probably going to be a 78. But a 79 is getting into the approaching the territory of it's not easy to take down the claim with like one piece of rebuttal or just to defeat one premise. And obviously the argument is starting to develop more where every piece of chain is starting to be developed. Now, in the same bracket, how do you then get up to an 82? I think it's about building up the chains, the links of analysis. So the stronger or the strength, the more stronger your analysis, the stronger your analysis gets, and then the additive holistic effect. So have you provided weighing, strategic commentary, and all these things? That's what helps the judge to realize that these are actually valuable claims in and of itself, rather than just claims themselves. So attaching meaning and value to these claims. And then what about like 82 versus 83? So 83 is the next bracket up. Sorry, I should say that the speaker scale is probably available in the Discord for the params, but you could have it up. I don't really want to, but I'll have a screenshot of the bracket in the next slide as well. So this is when you start to get into preemption. So the value of the mechanism. So in our best case, how do our mechanisms work? In our worst case, how do they not? So really giving some layering to the mechanisms of how good they actually are. And also telling the judges exactly why you're winning the debate. And really the independent mechanization that I've explained starts to be introduced. So insulating yourself from attacks, explaining specifically how you know, the value of these mechanisms are actually coming in. But what about 85 plus? And I think this is where the robust chain of logics come in about requiring multiple points to be responded to rather than just one link. All the burdens are met to a very high standard. So the key questions that make the case comparative, do they have the level of comparative that they say they do? The explanation of the importance is there. Maybe they're missing a mechanism or two, which is fine, but they don't harm the burden fulfillment that's been set out. And then also they've explained in strategic commentary, this is specific, about how much they're winning by, and how they're specifically beating another team, and by like why the other team is specifically worse than them. So doing the commentary on other teams necessarily as well. And then also when doing the best case and worst case scenario is integrating material from other teams within it and explaining how their burdens are worse, and then internally weighing cases and impact in the case and giving reasons to favor their own stuff whilst integrating it into other cases. And all the stuff about flipping rebuttal and very strong weighing and all that sort of stuff. This is very hard to conceptualize, but hopefully the heuristics and the sort of layers or levels of those heuristics changing over the brackets, it makes sense. But I just want you to note that these are really important heuristics that I think you need to recognize. And this changes from debate to debate. And obviously, it's going to be a very hard section of the talk to give, but hopefully, I've given you some pointers on this. Right. And then talking about just a specific bracket in particular that I don't think is very hard to reach, but to be honest, I think is pretty simple. So arguments are relevant. Really clear is just that you're talking about the motion without contradiction and not comparative. It's very clear what you're attempting to do. Core issues, the characterization, framing, and arguments linked to your burdens, and the explanation of the debate of how your speech fits into the debate is clear. Obvious logical gaps. The explanatory, gap is large. Say if it was obvious, right? Or important that it, harms you so much that it doesn't take much to strongly question those things. That's what I would say is obvious. When a team or a speaker goes like, well, actually, one part of your speech wasn't particularly proven well, but everything else was. That is not a sufficient reason for that. Maybe that's not reason for them to be an 82, but you can partially get into bracket. You don't have to fulfill every bullet point in the bracket to even enter the first number of that bracket. So that's really important. And then when it says good, that doesn't necessarily mean destructive. So these are the things you should think about. I know that language, I guess it's very subjective what you actually interpret these things to be. But you should take this I think this activity is a very difficult activity, and you need to take people at their best in what actually is the value of what they're saying, and what does these scales actually mean. And I think that would make it slightly better as well. So allocate these bigger points effectively. So we have an example motion here. So this house believes that social media has done more harm than good, and we are opening our position. And I just remember, sorry, this was a motion that I did it a couple of years ago in a debating tournament, and one of the debaters at St Andrews ran this argument, and I wasn't in their team, and I was trying to beat them, obviously. So I'm not trying to say that they but like I think they got lower speaker points than they actually should have done, and I think that they basically tried. So I'm just going to go through this example because it was just something that stuck out to me. Was that social media has been essential for political gains such as protest organizations, spreading political content, etc. So what I want to think through is what are the important burdens, and then what are the layers on top which make a speech great. So some burdens that you could have in this motion are: how does social media work? Who uses social media to meet the premise of the argument that we have? So what would be the comparative outside of that? So how would you then, now this is the thing that matters the most, right? So not just who uses it, but how those people would use it on other comparatives, so like echo chambers or peer groups. And that starts to move from like 78 to then into 79 and 80, because you're doing the more harm than good claim rather than just saying like, oh, well, they can use it for political gains, which is a fine claim and probably gets you reasonably high up into the scale, but then doing the comparative work to explain, well, actually other alternatives are worse for these things, are because it's still true to suggest that you can like organize a rally better on Twitter or Facebook groups and stuff like that. That is still a fine claim, because then you're proving that it's good, right? But explaining why it's better than other forms is the thing that would maybe push you into the next bracket, right? So this is a good example. Then how do people receive the content? So then this is another thing, because you could prove quite simply that the stuff exists for you to do this, right? But then if you don't prove how people receive it, how they like evaluate it, internalize it, and how they actually prefer this messaging compared to someone coming up to them in the street with a leaflet, or their peer group pressuring them to do this sort of stuff. For example, they maybe research the information online, they have take more time to think about it. It's not someone who's like actively trying to get in their face about it, all these sorts of things. You start to then analyze it in depth as to then why it's efficacious, like why it's actually effective, rather than the fact that you just can do these things, right? And why do their opinions change? So you could say, well, they receive the content and they might receive it well, but then you need to prove, well, why do their incentives then actually shift? So, for example, social media is very pervasive. You might see loads and loads of posts about Gaza and all that sort of stuff, and maybe you might, boycott something. And then also the malleability of people. So, all these iPad kids nowadays who are like chronically online. Maybe you're doing this, like it's always in your face. There's an algorithm, and it's like giving you content preferences that you yourself might want, but you've not explicitly told the algorithm to give you. Maybe social media is the only counterforce, and like and then there's no other counterforce because social media is so ubiquitous, right? Or you have confirmation bias because the algorithm is telling you what you want to know, or that you had apathy in the status quo because you live in a country that's not very like you're a right-wing country and you're very left-wing, but you can go and find left-wing communities online and now you're not apathetic anymore and all that sort of stuff, and you can actually do something. You have hope. These are just interlocking mechanisms about psychology, right? Like these are different reasons why you could want something based on the social media, based on your psychology, based on things we know about biology. These are just independent mechanisms which would require 3 different things to take down, right? So this is the sort of thing that we'd want from this. And then, but also you could give maybe 1 of those things, and then maybe that wouldn't get you high up in the speaker scale, but then that would be like, it's additive, right? But it's additive in like its quality, not in just its quantity, because, when people say 10 mechanisms panel, they're not going to give 10. And then framing, right? Like, how then do you maximize the margin of victory? For example, protest organization. Can you give some good examples of this? So, for example, WhatsApp was really instrumental for the Arab Spring. And I think that you could talk about how that had massive liberalization effects. Forums, like, for example, like Reddit forums, like, for example, if you're gay in like a very homophobic country, often a lot of people go on forums or talk to people like them that they can never meet because they're scared to go out and like talk to people about their identity, and you can talk more about how the margins of actually how much this affects people, and why is this unlikely on the other side, because they just don't, if there was very little social media or it's created loads of harms. Yes, there could be lots of harms, for example, that people are chronically online and then their minds are corrupted and stuff like that. But, this is the unique way we get some of these benefits, right? And then think about that as rebuttal and integrate it. So that Gov will talk about harmful contents. They'll talk about like agency violation because you haven't consented to these things and like all that sort of stuff, or like they steal your content through like big data and they harvest your preferences, and like they may create echo chambers so you could get stuck in like a right or a left-wing echo chamber and stuff like that. Or that people don't touch grass, like they are too online, and like all this sort of stuff you can already think about in and integrate it. And then I don't know, I feel like I'm also giving like how to do motions as well. I don't know why I'm doing this, but like this is the sort of thing that people would be like integrating into their rebuttal already and being preemptive and trying to think about these things, and then also then weighing against those things. Like, for example, like, well, if there's an agency violation, who's actually winning on agency? Not letting the judges decide that, but you yourself letting the judges know that you want them to win. You want to win on an agency. This is how they're going to win on agency, rather than them saying in the OA, well, actually, we decided as a panel that this team was an agency violation because they've proven this, right? So that's the thing that starts to build the speaker points up more. So hopefully you can see how you then build up those layers to then get higher and higher in the speaker scale. But I know, again, it's quite abstract because it's very hard to, you need a 7-minute speech. Okay. So I don't know when the sessions are meant to end. I think it's 11. Let me just check the thing. But 11:05. Oh my God. Right. So does anyone have any questions? We have 5 minutes. I can stop here and I can send everyone the recording for this next bit because I'm doing it somewhere else. If not, I can briefly talk about this.
I have a question.
Yes, Mia.
If you are listening to a speech and a speaker or a team internally contradicts themselves, like their whole case is about providing a benefit to a particular ACT group, and then in rebuttal or in sort of a later piece of analysis, they say that that ACT group is actually unimportant, should that just be taken as them internally mitigating their impacts, or does that count against the team in any other way?
Yes. So this is a good question. So if they accidentally do it or don't give any reasons why that is true, you would just dismiss the claim and maybe just dock the speaker that said it slightly, unless that's obviously all else being equal. I mean, they could give us some really good analysis and then you wouldn't have to dock them. But like, if they actually go into it a little bit, then actually contradict their speaker, that's actually technically being not clear because your line of argument is being disrupted. So that would be my interpretation of the scale, but I think some people could be more liberal with that. It becomes a problem when a speaker, and it happens a lot, way more than you might think, a speaker might give lots of reasons why that group is not true to try and hedge their bets against another team, right? They might go like, a team might like absolutely storm your first speaker, and the second speaker in a blind panic goes, oh wait, we'll weigh on something else because all of this is not important, so panel, you shouldn't believe this. This is when it becomes an issue, because then you've actively given reasons to discredit your first speaker. And that is when I think the speaker points, I think, should be go down quite significantly. Because not only would it probably be a tension within your case, i.e. like, you can't then do all of that and then whip or weigh or do other things towards your first speaker. So it would probably you probably evaluate the material which is positive and you like separately, and then also the material that is contradictory. How much has that affected the clarity of what the speaker has said in their own speech and the clarity of their own line of argument across the team? Because obviously speakers are individual, but the line of argument is probably not. So what I would suggest is, if their other material is clear enough to credit, then there are some logical gaps or there's deficits, right? Then it will probably be in the bracket that says some things clear enough to follow, but some things are not. And then you sort of meet in the middle and go towards like a 76, 77 sort of vibe, or 75. Or if the stuff that they say that is good is technically also reliant upon the rebuttal not being there, then that would be even lower. And then in the case, I guess, that is really, really good, and then they've only done one or two reasons, then it would be slightly higher than 76, 77. So it's about sort of like working out how the bad material interacts with the speaker's good material and how that overall affects the line of argument. And that's quite an abstract response, because I can't think of a reason, example off the top of my head. But does that answer your question?
Yeah,
You can
that makes
clarify.
sense. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's all right. Any other questions? Okay, just for the purposes of time, I was going to talk about, I think this is actually one of the most important things in debating, like evaluating burdens correctly. But I actually think that Aymaan has done enough on this in terms of just analysis and being critical about mechanisms, and also just what you should be crediting. So I think this was probably, actually a lot of this stuff would be similar. But if any of you are interested, please send me a message, and I will send a link directly to you when I've actually done this presentation elsewhere, as Aymaan is introduced at the top of the thing. I'm doing it in a couple of weeks, another training event, and I will post it on YouTube. So if you want this, please send me a message on Discord or Facebook, and I'll send it to you. And obviously I'll link it in the SSDC YouTube comments as well. So are there any further, and this, sorry, the reason for this is because we had problems with recording, so apologies for not getting to this stage. Are there any other questions from anyone? I'll stop sharing my screen just so I can see if there's any questions.
Yeah, I'll stop recording now as well.